streets of New York City today. The demonstration comes just 2 days before the United Nations hosts a summit on the issue. UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon is planning to join today's march. Former Vice President Al Gore, who's devoted his public life since losing the 2000 presidential election to raising awareness about climate change, will also reportedly be marching in New York today. The march and the UN summit this week come as a wave of new reports and studies paint an increasingly dire picture when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and rising sea levels, raising the question not just of how much damage has been done, but how much of that damage may now be irreversible. There have been similar marches and rallies around the world this weekend as well. About 30,000 people marched in Melbourne, Australia earlier today, and many thousands more are expected to march in London later today. That'll begin later this morning. And in Rio, famous Christ the Redeemer statue was lit up green Friday night to raise awareness for climate change. MSNBC's Ned Reznikoff is standing by at 58th Street in the Avenue of the Americas. That's not far from Columbus Circle, where the march is expected to begin later this morning. So, Ned, I'm just looking at the scene behind you. Obviously, they're a few short of 100,000 right now, but tell us a little bit about what they're expecting today.
Yeah, they're expecting more than 100,000 people, people from all over the United States and all over the world. You mentioned this is the largest climate change march in history is what they're expecting. It's also probably going to be the most diverse climate change march to ever happen. So we're going to expect people not just from the environmental activism community, but also labor unions, different community organizing groups, churches, a lot of locals who were affected by Hurricane Sandy or other extreme weather events. Right now, as you can see, there aren't very many people out there, but there are a few. There's a meditation vigil going on right now in Central Park, and obviously a pretty pronounced police presence.
It's so unusual, I guess, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, that he's called the summit this week, but he's also going to be marching today with the protesters. Also, apparently, Al Gore's going to be there. Talk a little bit about what do we know about why Ban Ki-moon has decided to do this. It seems an unusual move for a Secretary General.
Well, I mean, with both the climate summit happening on Tuesday and the march happening today, there are no specific policy demands being made, but both have a similar objective, which is to generate the political will to take some sort of significant action on climate change. And I think Ban Ki-moon's very aware of that. He wants to march today to demonstrate to leaders at the UN summit that there is a lot of popular support for something aggressive being done.
All right, MSNBC's Ned Reznikoff standing by this morning, just a few blocks from here where that march is. I think I saw an extra person walk into the shot during it, so they're getting closer to 100,000 right now, but we'll keep an eye on it as that goes on today. Thanks for giving us a sense of what's going on. Appreciate that. And just to give us put in some perspective here what we're talking about when it comes to this rally today, this is what an estimated 100,000 people actually looks like when they're gathered in one place. That's an anti-Vietnam demonstration in Washington back in 1970, over 40 years ago. Crowd that turned out 7 years earlier. Before that, back in 1963 for the March on Washington, that was about 250,000 people, 250,000 people. And this is what's believed to be the largest political protest in American history. This is a gathering in Central Park here in New York in 1982. People demanding nuclear disarmament. This was at the height of the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR. We will see where today's march ends up falling in comparison to some of these past marches. Of course, as we say, today's march comes 2 days before the start of the United Nations Climate Summit. And the hope is that all UN member states will create some kind of a global agreement in the next year to limit the world to less than 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures. That's according to the summit's website. We don't know if today's march will mean anything when it comes to this week's summit, especially with the leaders of some of the biggest emission-producing countries like China, Russia, and India. The leaders of those countries not attending. This week could also, though, be a prelude to next year's International Climate Summit, which is scheduled to be in Paris. It's a big day for climate change activists. The question, of course, is will this end up meaning anything? Congressman Keith Ellison of Minnesota will be among potentially hundreds of thousands of marchers today. But first, he joins us here today. Congressman, thanks for taking a few minutes. So I guess let me just ask you that question. I mean, we show some of these old, some of the old footage from in pictures from old rallies in the past. I also remember more recently, the last big one of these in New York, I can remember, was right before the Iraq War. And I'm guessing it was about 100,000 people who came here to say, don't invade Iraq, don't do the war. And man, they invaded Iraq, they had the war, and we're living with the consequences. Does protest mean what it used to mean? Do you think something's going to actually come out of this?
Yes, protest means a lot, and people who are going down to put their feet in the street are making an important statement. Of course, it does require that people who are in a policy-making role will listen to the wisdom of the people. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in Iraq. But it did happen in the civil rights marches in the 1960s. And so today, we're making a moral appeal, and I'm joining that, and Ban Ki-moon, a lot of people who are in policy-making role are standing with the people saying we've got to limit our emissions now, and we've got to stand up to the fossil fuel industry.
So what's going to happen? So there's the march today, then the UN is having this climate summit this week. Do you think, as we say, it's the president of China not going to be attending? I guess he's sending a deputy. India not participating, Russia not participating. Some of these big, emissions-producing countries not going to be. Do you think, is there anything meaningful that's going to come out of this summit this week?
No one will be able to ignore the action that's going to happen today, and this action today will affect the summit, and the summit will affect Paris. It's coming up in not too long. So all these things have a cumulative effect. So I just want to urge everybody who is able to come on down. If you're not able to come, tweet, Facebook, do a solidarity thing where you live, but let your voice be heard, because all over this world, people are being affected by this. Mostly people who are low-income people, who are least able to avoid the negative effects of extreme weather events, heat waves, floods, all that stuff.
Well, so what does it mean for those? I mean, you talk about the consequences that people are feeling every day. The kind of agreement you're looking for the United States to enter into with other countries, the kind of climate change agreement you're looking for and hoping for, what does that mean in terms of, tell the average person out there, how is their life going to be different to comply with that? Are they going to have to give something up? How does their life change for the United States to cooperate with other countries to deal with climate change?
Yes, your life may change a little bit, but perhaps for the better. I mean, going zero waste, making a more walkable community, making a community in which we try to live more harmoniously with the environment, things like that. I mean, we can live very high quality lives and will if we live in a way that doesn't emit all these.
Well, what is it? Just like, let's say, the zero waste. What would that mean? What does that mean to in my
composting?
What do I do?
Well, that means that instead of just throwing all that stuff away, you're going to compost it, recycle it, reuse it. And you know what? Once you get into the groove of it, it's very easy to do. A lot of cities have gone single sort, which makes it a lot more convenient. And so the fact is that it's really a small thing that we can do, but it will take some change. It will take some change in culture. But just remember, people used to smoke inside. People used to drink. People used to, and drive. All these cultural changes have made our lives better. It's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, if you're a young person, this is a good time to talk to mom and dad about sorting that trash and things like that, and pulling those cords out of the wall when you're not using the appliance and all those kind of things.
All right, right here at MSNBC, we're going to be covering the climate march today, so stay right here for all the latest developments in that. My thanks right now to Congressman Keith Ellison for joining us before he heads off to the rally this morning. Appreciate that, Congressman. Joining me now at the table, we have April Ryan. She's the White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks. Beth Fooey, senior editor at MSNBC. So let's talk about the politics of this, the politics of climate change, because we know that the issue here in the United States has been, this is sort of a consequence in part of divided government, of having a Democratic White House and then a Republican Congress. But even when the president's party had complete control in 2010, they weren't able to get cap and trade done. So now we start talking about this from an international standpoint. There's going to be this UN summit this week, and as the congressman says, in Paris next year, there's going to be another meeting. And then the issue starts to come out of that, like if there's some kind of a treaty, if the United States decides they want to enter some kind of treaty with other countries, do they then have to try to ratify that treaty with the Senate? If you ratify a treaty with the Senate, it takes 2/3. When do you get 2/3 of the Senate to agree with anything? So the question here is this something that the White House can work around, or are they going to have to get the Senate to approve something eventually?
Especially when you have the possibility of Republicans that could run the Senate and run the House together. Republicans are not necessarily for the issue of climate change. When Al Gore was stomping, they said, oh, he was this guy who was just trying to find something to deal with when he lost the White House. But Al Gore hit the nail squarely on the head. There is a problem. And Congressman Ellison hit the nail squarely on the head. There are holes in the ozone, just simply put, because of emissions. We're now seeing that in many states, to include mine, I just had an emission test a couple of weeks ago, $14 to make sure that I wasn't emitting any carbons into the sky to help create those holes. But those holes in the ozone are actually creating things that we've seen. Katrina, when people in the poor areas live in those places that are more susceptible to effects from natural events, to include what happened when we saw the breach of the levees from water rising in the lower income areas. We're also seeing the effects of this in other countries, to include places like Nigeria. They're trying to grapple, and Africa, they're trying to grapple with agriculture, and the dynamic change in weather that we've been seeing affects countries like that when their populations are growing. And here, just last winter, we saw on the East Coast all of that snow, extreme weather conditions, from hot summers to cold winters.
I guess that's the question I have is, what changes the politics on this, though? Because ultimately this has to be, a political solution, whether that's the Congress doing something here, whether that's an international treaty. And we keep saying, there's one report after another, there's one warning after another. The science seems fairly well established at this point. Where does the momentum come from that's not there now? Does a protest do that?
I think it's great that people are coming out to talk about this. It's a huge issue, as you said. I mean, it is a global issue. The science is absolutely clear that something must be done. But this is a function of divided government, as you said before, where we're not really going to see a lot happening in politics in the United States anytime soon. I mean, there's a very good chance that Republicans are going to take control of the Senate in November. Even if they don't, their ability to block and obstruct is going to prevent anything from happening on this, because like so many other issues, there's a huge red-blue divide on this. Republicans in most of the districts, certainly in their House districts, very, very heavily Republican districts, they don't see a problem there with climate change. You've got Mitch McConnell, who is running in a tight race against Alison Lundergan Grimes, who is likely going to be reelected almost entirely on the issue of coal, as a protector of coal. You've got Bobby Jindal, who this past week, he's considered one of the more intellectual heavyweights of the party, Rhodes Scholar and all of that. He refused to say whether man-made climate change was an issue. He kept saying, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a scientist. Well, people who are scientists have said unequivocally this is happening. But for some reason, Republicans right now are in the grip of a lot of people who want to say that this is not happening, and I don't see a policy change.
Yeah, no, I say we say it's the red-blue thing, and then obviously you look at that race in Kentucky, and it's not as if Alison Lundergan Grimes is out there saying, well, actually, I disagree with Mitch McConnell on coal. I mean, she's saying, hey, I think the president has a war on coal, too. So there are Democrats, too, and the momentum has to cut across both party lines. Anyway, we will see how this rally develops today, what comes from it this week. But coming up next, the new and different Syrian terror cell the U.S. officials suspect could be more of a threat to attack the United States than ISIS. That's next.